Good afternoon and welcome to another Illuminated conversation. This is a series of conversations we've been holding bi-monthly to really share out on topics that are not only central to the work that we're doing, but what we're seeing and hearing from the clients and teams that we support in the work that we do. And we're excited because it's a topic we are really passionate about and different from some of the other Illuminated conversations we've held. This one's a little bit more narrow and focused in terms of really how we as individuals, as leaders, really identify workplace stressors and how we can help support and build a more resilient team. We here at the Lumen Group are really on a mission to co-create and really shape how we work in the world today. We're a team and leadership firm that really is trying to create and foster the sense of resilience, engagement, and psychological safety within the workplace. And we do that through our workshops and retreats, our individual and group coaching, and our leadership academies. And we do that at all levels of leadership, knowing that we can have impacts in different ways. I'll introduce you here to the team. I'm Dr. Emily Hedberg. I'm a senior consultant here at Lumen. I'm also joined today by Dr. Megan Broger, our founder and president, and also highlight some other team members who are typically here, Donnie and Danielle. You know, as I mentioned, as we think about the mission that we're on to really create a different experience in the workplace, we at the Lumen Group take a bit of a different approach, integrating psychology, neuroscience, and biology to really provide solutions that are a bit different, a different take on the idea of stress management and resilience. And as you see here is really rooted in our centered leadership model. So thinking about from a perspective around neurology and biology, if we can start as leaders from more of a centered place, meaning, you know, we're grounded, we're regulated from a nervous system standpoint, it enhances our ability to be effective in terms of how we connect and communicate with other people, which ultimately leads to the climate, the workplace climate that we contribute to, both either in positive or maybe not so positive ways. Central to that philosophy is really building our own self-awareness when we can understand our own nervous system and how that promotes either being grounded or regulated, or those things that really take us off center, things that can cause more stress and lead us to being less effective in terms of being able to, again, communicate effectively, access the resources, the knowledge that we might have as we're leading and engaging with the people around us. And we know that self-awareness is really important before we can get to that other awareness. But if we lack some of that self-awareness of how we're showing up, how we're impacting the people around us, that has some other implication and ripple effects that can, again, lead to less positive interactions in the workplace. As part of that model, we teach and guide individuals and leaders through different exercises that can help us to get back grounded or in range when maybe we find ourselves a little out of that, when maybe we're rushing to get to a meeting or maybe have things go not as planned, like I had this morning. So to help us come into this space and into this conversation in a more intentional way, I'm going to lead us through a bit of a breathing exercise. So with this, it's going to be just 30 minutes or 30 seconds to a minute for us to really just connect and, again, be more purposeful in how we're engaging in today's conversation. We know that our breath is a really powerful tool to bring us back to center and to get grounded. It's something we carry with us everywhere we go. And as we're stressed or anxious, oftentimes we can lose sight of our breathing or become breathing in a way that's less effective or conducive to really engaging that relaxation response that we need in those moments where we're feeling stress or tense. So what I'm going to ask you to do is find just a neutral gaze, or you can feel free to close your eyes if that feels comfortable or in your position to do so. And take a moment to just take stock of your breath, not needing to change or modify it, but just notice your inhale, your exhale. Maybe even noticing in your body where that's coming from, maybe finding that you're breathing a little bit more from your chest versus your abdomen, maybe in through your nose or your mouth. Oftentimes when we're in that position of feeling stressed or anxious, we feel like, "Ah, I just need more air. I need to breathe." But what I'm going to encourage us to do is to really focus on our exhale. So just taking a normal inhale and then exhale, seeing if you can push that out 1, 2, 3, maybe even 4 seconds. Again, allowing your lungs to fill back up in your inhale. And then as you're exhaling, see if you can lengthen the amount of seconds it takes to fully exhale. Do what feels natural and comfortable in your body. Again, focusing on that inhale and more about that exhale, seeing if you can lengthen the time it takes to fully exhale that breath. And now I want you to pause and just reflect a little bit on what you notice being different from when we started the exercise to now. Sometimes we think about, or I can feel this way, oh, these silly breathing exercises, but then you notice some of those subtle changes or shifts that really help us in those moments. And again, the more that we can slow and steady our breath, ideally allowing our belly to breathe as opposed to those shallow chest breaths, it helps to induce that sense of calm and relaxation.
I just want to jump in real quickly, Emily, because that was absolutely my experience in this exercise. And it just reminded me of, I recently read an article and they were talking about how beneficial it can be for humans to hear bird song because kind of biologically, when that is in our environment, it's a signal that we're safe. Like there's no predators, there's no environmental threats, like when the birds are singing, like the environment is stable. And so I feel that way sometimes with that opportunity to take those deep breaths. It's a way of reminding the body, yeah, there's a lot going on in the environment, but it's okay here.
I'm safe, I'm
Yeah,
present.
yeah.
Yeah, I read that must have been the similar article. And even that we can listen to that just on, YouTube,
Yes.
as
Yeah,
opposed to having to be outside in nature and getting the same benefits.
right.
Because birds don't sing when there's threat around them.
Exactly.
We share these exercises because, again, in that 30 seconds to a minute, as we're always running around to the next thing, you can be like, oh, I don't have time for that. 30 seconds can really make a tangible impact in what we're experiencing and noticing. And as we think back to that framework, when we're centered, that's going to allow us to be able to access and be more effective in terms of how we communicate and collaborate with the people around us.
Yeah.
So thanks for sharing in an exercise, everyone, and appreciate all of you that are joining us here today for a really important conversation. As I mentioned earlier, these are just a series of conversations we get excited about and look forward to, but it's really that opportunity to share back what we're learning, noticing, information that we're gathering as we engage with some of our clients or even out in the community. Megan and I have been doing several events, some workshops and some other events where we've gotten to be out in the community working with teams or just getting to know individuals. And we've been doing more of that informal poll of what are some of those stressors within the workplace? What causes that or can really contribute it to that and to get a sense of people's experiences. And so today, the conversation is really going to be around what are some of those common experiences or causes as we're individuals or as we're leading teams. How do we get a sense of how that impacts the team itself or ways that we can gather that information, but then to really make some change that can have a tangible impact, especially more at that root level. So as we've been doing these informal polls, and Megan, I'd be curious to get your perspective, we've been hearing just a lot of commonalities in terms of, what are some of those stressors? We hear things like really tight deadlines, maybe lack of resources, whether that's time, financially, team based. Clarity can be really challenging. I don't know what the expectations are. Maybe having some challenges with even leadership, it could be in that sense of kind of clarity or sharing expectations. But also we've been hearing a lot of themes around just interpersonal challenges, whether that's team conflict or who are just not connecting in the same way, getting the work done, can lead to a lot of those challenges. We hear a lot of that. Megan, the things that you would add or themes you've been hearing as you think about some of our recent engagements.
Yeah, I would definitely echo the things that you've already said. And I think, what comes to mind, additionally, and I was just in a conversation with a team before this, is the challenge with navigating competing priorities. And very closely related to that is the ability or the practice of prioritizing. And so that feeling like there's this kind of tyranny of urgency. If everything is a priority, then really nothing is a priority. And, where do I focus my time and energy? And so, we can kind of think about these things to a certain extent as individual stressors. So competing priorities, lack of prioritization, high workload, lack of clarity on job expectations, but they often kind of feed each other as well. So there can be these individual stressors that lead to kind of more collective systemic stressors as too.
And I'd encourage, for those of you joining the webinar here today, feel free to drop in the chat, the Q&A feature. We'd love to hear from you too. What are some of the experiences you're having and noticing? Because as Megan and I are highlighting, although we work with different types of organizations and teams, we see a lot of overlap in terms of those common stressors. In some of the work we do, in addition to those stressors, some of it's also helping to identify, what might be some of the underlying or less obvious factors, right? The things that maybe we're not talking about or naming, but is definitely a part of that experience. Some of the things I can think of could be some around the organizational climate or team climate, things that we talked about last time, but even things like, lack of autonomy, maybe not getting as much recognition. Maybe there's insecurity in the job, even like we talked about last time with, changes to the team structure or expectations. And it's some of those dynamics that are important to also highlight and call out, what's really contributing to some of the other experiences people have.
Yeah, no, absolutely. A few things are coming to mind. I think one is, the extent to which we can kind of understand and differentiate stressors from stress. And so, as you were describing, what are some of those root causes? What are some of the things that that in and of themselves are stressors or that lead to some of these stressors? And then how are people experiencing those, which is more about that kind of stress response.
Yeah.
And sometimes that can be an individual experience, and sometimes it can be a collective experience, because some of these stressors that we've already talked about in terms of kind of competing priorities and tight deadlines and lack of resources, those are more organizational or structural. And there's also a whole host of interpersonal stressors that people are experiencing. And you mentioned, a couple already. Clarity can be part of that, clarity of expectations, whether that's from or for, from my supervisor, for my direct reports, or from my colleagues. The level of independence or autonomy I feel like I have, is it too much or too little? And so it's bringing to mind a model that we often really reference in our work with teams broadly, but certainly around this topic, is the SCARF model from the Neuro Leadership Institute. People are familiar with that. And it's this idea that our brains are wired in such a way to kind of trigger the stress response whether or not it's a physical or a social threat.
Mhm.
And so the SCARF model it represents some of those really common social stressors or social threats in workplace environments, which are things like status. How am I feeling compared to my colleagues? Certainty. How much clarity do I have on what's expected of me or what success looks like? Autonomy
Yeah.
has to do with my level of independence. Relatedness is how connected do I feel to my colleagues? How much access do I have? And fairness has to do with the F has to do with fairness, which is around how do I feel like I am being treated equitably or
Mm.
fairly, and do I see others being treated in that way as well? So I think there's, some of those underlying factors are really important to understand and
Yeah.
consider, in addition to maybe some of the more organizational or structural ones too.
And I think that's an important point, Megan, because it also provides some just language and understanding that we all have these social needs in the workplace, that it isn't just, time and resources and the technology, although those are really important things. There are other factors at play that when we don't consider, we might implement solutions that really only address the kind of symptoms as opposed to the root cause. I can even think about a team that we supported where an individual shared, I think we just need some training around how to better organize our time. And, as you get into that, it's like, well, share more, help me understand why you think that's the intervention that's needed. And through uncovering in the conversation, it was really, I'm wasting so much time because I don't know which channel some of this information has been communicated. So I'm scanning my emails, I'm looking at Slack or whatever channel that they use, our project management system to say, oh, well, where did Megan ask me that question and provide information? And we're wasting a lot of time because there's not clarity on how do we communicate with one another in a way that's really helpful and a solution that's actually going to have some tangible impact or
Yeah,
change.
absolutely.
Other, thoughts as you think about really getting to the root or cause of what might be driving some of those stressors.
I think you mentioned workplace or team climate. I think that's certainly an area where there's so much to consider in terms of how is that understood and how is it defined. And I think for a lot of teams, we are still really trying to understand what does climate look like, and what impact does it have, whether or not we're in the same physical space
Mm,
as our colleagues, whether or not we're across 4 or 5 different time zones, whether or not we will ever have the opportunity of sitting in the same room as somebody. Some of those stressors around it's not just, is this person in their cube right now, but it's what time zone is this person in?
mm,
And do I might know the job that they're in, but do I know who's in that job right now? And so
yeah.
some of that really kind of familiarity that I think people are now understanding and recognizing happened organically isn't happening in the same
In the
way.
same way.
And that kind of confusion and uncertainty around, what does my workplace environment look like, and how are people interacting with each other, and when and why, that can
Yeah.
create a lot of stress as well.
Well, and I think you're also highlighting the impacts to the team in
Yeah.
some of those examples. Some of that could be productivity, effectiveness in the role itself, but you're also highlighting the importance around just some of those team dynamics, right? That can cause confusion, which could lead to more conflict, less engagement or collaboration, perhaps.
Yeah.
And as we've talked about before, that can really erode trust on the team,
Yes.
which has a big impact
Mm-hmm.
in not only what we're doing, but how we're doing that.
Yep. Yep.
As we think about going from some of the causes to, how do we start to uncover or get a sense of what is leading to stress on the team and how can we create an action plan to make some things different? What are some ways that you think through that process of identifying or mapping out stressors for a team?
Yeah, a few different ways, but I'll just highlight in the interest of time here, one approach that that we have found the need for pretty recently is really an opportunity to facilitate a conversation within teams around what are the stressors you're experiencing. That can be really important for any number of reasons, but the two that I'll again highlight now, one is that sometimes I can feel like I'm the only one experiencing this stressor, and that can feel really
Yeah.
isolating. And the conversation allows me to recognize, oh yeah, no, that's not true at all.
Yeah.
And similarly, how often are supervisors or leaders able to get kind of a distilled and concrete list of stressors that people are experiencing, such that then we have some information where we say, okay, how are these things influencing one another? Where's the
Yeah.
greatest impact for action? And so that really that opportunity to pause on the doing of the work and being willing to have a conversation around what are people experiencing as they're
Yeah.
doing the work, that has been hugely beneficial.
Well, and it requires us to step out of the day to day to
Yeah.
really analyze it. And sometimes when we're so close to it or we're a part of that stress system, it can be hard to really separate and be a little bit more critical in how
Yep.
we're thinking about it.
Yep.
Because I agree, right? We could, do surveys or one-on-one conversations, interviews to try to get a sense of that. But there's a lot of power in collectively bringing people together to have those conversations. And
Mm-hmm.
I had to smile when you said, part of that is really just having people hear that it's not just me that's experiencing it. I
Yeah.
can think of a recent event we were at, and as people were kind of filling out their informal what causes stress, they're like, I'm sure this is just me, or this is just my workplace. And for us to have that conversation to say, That's actually pretty common. We hear that quite frequently. There is something validating about that experience, and it really opens up the dialogue to hear other people's perspectives and ideas when we're able
Mm-hmm.
to listen and learn from those around us.
Yeah, absolutely.
Megan, what's an example of maybe a way that we gather all this information, get a sense of what are some of those stressors. When we've narrowed it down, how do we make meaningful change, or to have things be different? And I don't know if there's an example that comes to mind.
Many examples, actually, and I think in some ways, while the circumstances are different, um, the the activity has been somewhat similar, which is to really, again, kind of think about of these stressors that our team is experiencing. And we can think about that in terms of like a circle of these things are all important
Mm,
and they matter. And then we have the other circle of and these are the things that we can actually influence or change. And that creates a Venn diagram. So there are a bunch of things that matter and are important, and there are things that we can influence and change. And where those two things overlap is where we can have some leverage. We can engage with a team on, okay, so of the things that matter and that you can influence, where do we start? And what does it
mhm.
look like to understand, to take action, to assess outcomes, so that we can actually make a concrete plan, not around the work itself, but around how we go about doing the work
Yeah.
with a mind towards reducing as many of those stressors as we can for people.
And I think that's important too. In thinking back on some of the workshops we've facilitated, it can be easy to get into, well, here's all the things that need to change
Yep.
from a technology standpoint, resource standpoint. And while that may be the case, it's important to really dial it into, so what can I influence?
Yep.
And then what maybe do I need to influence up the chain to maybe have some of those broader changes? But to also make it very tangible. Sometimes we work with teams and they have these grand plans, which is really amazing. And
Yeah.
we also need to think about how can we create some momentum and some quick wins to
Yep.
see that the impact of the effort is really worth our time.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's something that we come across a lot, that teams might feel like they've got some nice clarity by virtue of their kind of team strategic plan or something like that. And that is important. It's important to have that shared vision and that
Yeah.
direction. That is often not the kind of thing that people struggle with day in and day out. And so an example of a recent team that we've worked with recognize that in the process of trying to achieve their mission, there is inherent and to a certain extent necessary internal competition.
Mm,
Whether that's for resources or whether that's um, kind of technical orientation. It's a multidisciplinary team. And so the goal was actually not to reduce that internal kind of competition and tension.
yeah.
That was part of what created the quality outputs, but it was more around what are a couple of specific things that we can do when in conversation with each
Mm,
other that are going to reduce the level of kind of negative interaction and increase productive
yeah.
conversation while in conflict. So,
Mm,
it can look like so many different things, but to your point, like getting down into what are some really small, tangible things that
yeah.
teams can do entirely for themselves, without the support, the infrastructure, or sometimes the finances that
Right.
might be required to take on bigger
Yeah.
issues.
The other thing that comes to mind for me then, Megan, too, is accountability, right? We can create these plans and have some clear priorities around here's what we're going to commit to doing differently to see some impacts. And then it's really the accountability around, so what are the process or systems or persons responsible to ensure that we're doing what
Yeah,
we as a team are committing to or saying we're going to do?
right.
And I think that's a really important element that we don't lose sight of, because then
Hmm.
it just becomes a big conversation and data gathering without
Yeah,
really change. And when that happens, again, going back to trust, that just erodes a lot of that trust and engagement. Well, what was the point
absolutely.
of
Yeah,
all of this
yep.
when there's no tangible difference?
That is such an important point, and I know we're close to time, but a really important point then to kind of end on is understanding the stressors and how people are experiencing stress in the workplace is so critical. That's something that we are spending a lot of time, energy, and effort on supporting teams and organizations and understanding and navigating. And when you engage in that kind of work and conversation, it creates an implicit, if not an explicit, understanding that there's going to be something done to help support or address that. So making sure that you're at a point where you can really dedicate some time and energy to not only understanding but taking action is so important so that you really do kind of move the needle in the right direction and not create even more of a backslide.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to sum it up, Megan, just in terms of when we're taking the time to really be intentional that we see that process through, and knowing, we at the Lumen Group get really excited about facilitating those conversations and the follow-up so that teams can make really lasting and sustainable change. In our minute remaining, I want to invite you all to our next Illuminated conversation where we're going to talk more about stress, but also micro strategies. So, how these micro strategies can have more of that macro impact, like we've been talking about here today. We'll give some examples, best practice, to really help support you and the teams that you support. That QR code will give you the link to be able to register for our time there, but would also encourage you to follow us along on our LinkedIn page or our website. On our website, you can find other Illuminated conversation recordings and other resources to support you and your teams. Well, thank you so much for your time, Megan,
Thank
and
you.
everyone joining here today. I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. You all too. Take care.